Hello everyone, my name is Caroline Esser from the University of Strasbourg in France, and I'm going to present our latest results on dynamic path planning for needle insertions during free breathing. But first, let me give a bit of context. In this work, we are focusing on image-guided percutaneous procedures, which includes all interventions involving the insertion of a needle. The main targeted applications are thermal ablations of tumors such as radiofrequency, microwave, or cryoablations that are increasingly used for the treatment of abdominal tumors. But the methods that we present here can also be extended to biopsies or various other types of punctures. Due to the complexity of the anatomy, it is essential to prepare the intervention in advance to choose a safe and efficient path. This task is even more difficult when we consider that the patient will be breathing during the intervention. Then the challenge is to preserve safety and efficiency in a moving environment that may require readjustments in real time. This motivates the need for dynamic planning. Our proposed pipeline for dynamic planning is in 3 steps. The first step is to find the best insertion point and direction based on preoperative images. In an actual setting, we would then track the movement of the body and track the progression of the needle. However, in this work, we focus only on the path planning algorithm, so the second step will be a rough simulation of the breathing motion to replace the tracking. The third step is to follow the progression of the needle in the animated environment and correct the initial trajectory in real time if necessary. Now let's detail these 3 steps. The first step initializes the pipeline by finding an initial entry point and orientation. This problem basically consists in finding an optimal needle placement that satisfies multiple placement constraints that can possibly be conflicting with each other. For this step, we use the previous works from Hamze et al. To find the best compromise. The approach relies on preoperative images that are static by definition. Both the tissue and the needle are assumed to be static, and the trajectory is considered as a straight 3D line from an entry point to a target. On this slide, we can see at the bottom of the slide the color map that represents the quality of the possible entry points, and in red, the trajectory that avoids ribs and vessels and reaches the target in the liver. In order to reproduce the conditions of an intervention and simulate motions, we used a simplified model of breathing cycles. The skin and ribs are modeled with an outward-inward cyclic motion, while the liver, tumor, and vessels have a slightly more complex motion, mostly upward-downward, with a small component of outward-inward motion as well, to follow the ribs and the skin. To evaluate our trajectory planning methods in a more realistic setup, we also introduced perturbations in the cyclic motion to break its uniformity. It is important to note here that this animation is computed separately from the dynamic planning that we're going to detail. The planning is constantly discovering the motions, as it would be the case if we were tracking the anatomy of a patient. Step 3 of our pipeline is the dynamic planning method that we propose to follow and adjust the path in real time to preserve the safety. The proposed RT-IT method consists of 2 phases, an observation phase and a correction and targeting phase. In the first phase, we first discretize the initial trajectory in small intervals. Then, for each organ considered as an obstacle, for instance the ribs and the vessels, we define a safety zone around the needle and we observe its movements during 10 seconds of simulation. We mark the parts of the organs that have entered the safety zone. These parts will be followed in the next step of the algorithm. We also measure the amplitude of displacement of the target. After the observation phase, Phase 2 consists in correcting the trajectory during the insertion of the needle, plus a final targeting. The simulation of the needle insertion is started at the insertion point, while the breathing simulation is still running. We iterate over the intervals of the path and choose the best strategy to move on. We distinguish two cases. The first case, illustrated in the top video, is when an organ enters the safety zone and then goes out of the way. In this case, we simply wait for a few seconds and start again the insertion when it's safe to move on. However, some organs may remain inside the safety zone. That's the second case illustrated on the bottom video. In this case, to avoid the organ, the trajectory has to be slightly corrected by a displacement vector vi+1. When we arrive close to the target point PT, we can assume that the obstacles nearby move along with the needle and the target. So, the main objective becomes to ensure an accurate targeting. If the target is not in its initial position, we adopt a similar wait or correct strategy. We wait that the target comes back in the direction of the trajectory to move on, as shown on the top video. If it doesn't, a displacement vector vi+1 is calculated to improve the accuracy, as illustrated in the bottom video. In this video, we can see first the initial trajectory computed in static condition to initialize the process. We can then see the animated anatomy and the dynamic path being computed in real time with the wait or correct strategy. Note the parts of the nearby organs that are colored in real time when getting too close to the path. In order to evaluate our RTIT approach, we also implemented a simple naive method that will be used as a reference. This method simply consists in inserting the needle from the insertion point with a constant speed and following the initial direction until the initial location of the target is reached. We never stop or voluntarily deviate from the planned trajectory. The result of this method being dependent on the moment of the breathing cycle at which the insertion is started and on the insertion speed, we decided to examine 16 different insertion scenarios that combine 8 different starting moments with 2 different speeds, as illustrated here. We defined different metrics to measure the performance of our method and compare it with the reference. The target positioning error helps us to evaluate the targeting accuracy. The distance between the actual path and the critical structures helps us evaluate the trajectory's safety. We also measured the maximal and average displacements that had to be performed during the RTIT method to quantify the degree of correction that had to be applied. These methods were implemented within the IPCAI platform and tested on 6 pre-segmented 3D models from the 3D IRCAD-B database. The 3 tables on this slide show the results of our experiments. Tables 1 and 2 underline that our RTIT method performs better than the reference method in terms of safety and accuracy of the targeting. Table 3 underlines that no deviation above 2.89 mm was necessary, which remains within the range of what is physically reproducible during an intervention. To conclude, we presented an intelligent dynamic planning approach based on an observation and wait-to-correct approach that provides safe and accurate targeting while requiring minimal deviations. In future works, real-time tracking can replace the simulation of step 2 in order to be coupled with a robotic insertion. Thank you for watching this presentation and don't hesitate to contact us if you have any questions.